Aloha. Welcome, everyone. I'm Helona Norton Westbrook. I'm the director of the museum. I'm just really thrilled and pleased to see so many people here for the opening of this incredible exhibition. And I wanted to go ahead and just thank all of you for your support in being here. And also, so much thanks to Sean Eichman, our incredible curator of Asian art, who has put together this exhibition with such scholarship and dedication and care. And we are just so fortunate to have him as part of our team and bringing amazing works and the interpretation of these works to our audience. So I just wanted to give that thanks to Sean Eichman and invite Sean Eichman up, who's going to introduce the incredible Terry Welch, who is the reason that we are all here tonight, because he has given us this incredible gift of modern Japanese art, which forms the basis of this truly groundbreaking scholarly exhibition that we are so happy to host here at the museum. So without further ado, I'm welcoming up Sean Eichman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sean Eichman, the curator of Asian art here at the Honolulu Museum of Art. It is my great honor to introduce Terry Welch, although I think Terry probably needs no introduction for a lot of you. Terry's relationship to the museum goes back not quite to when I was born, but almost. I think 1971. 1972 was the first time that Terry visited the Honolulu Museum of Art, right after he had fallen in love with Japan and totally changed his life, which maybe he'll share some of that story with us this evening. Over the course of time, Terry has really, the title of this exhibition, Transformation, is a particularly apt title when it comes to Terry, because Terry, through his relationship with the museum, has completely transformed us. Terry has now been the source of two major exhibitions that we've done. The first was Literati Modern in 2007. For those of you that remember that exhibition, that involved an amazing gift purchase from Terry that really pushed the Honolulu Museum of Art and Honolulu to the forefront of studies on modern Japanese painting. And that's a place that we've really been able to expand upon and still hold today. And this exhibition is very much a continuation of that exhibition. In 2017, Terry first contacted me about the idea of another gift of his collection that ultimately wound up bringing another 126 works of modern Japanese art to the museum, which means that we now have potentially the leading collection of modern Japanese art outside of Japan anywhere in the world. And it's truly a remarkable resource and something that the Hawaii community can take great pride in. With that, I would like to introduce Terry and turn it over to him. Terry will be talking today about three of the artists who feature prominently in the exhibition: Tanomura Chokunyū, Hirai Bisen, and Shirakura Nihō. Terry? Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. I've spoken in this auditorium once before in 2008. It was a symposium. It was actually 2008, but you're off only by a year. And I was a speaker for that following the Literati Modern exhibition, which was inaugurated in September of 2008, right before the crash. And I looked out, and there were 7 people in the audience. So what happened? It's really wonderful to see all of you here. And it's going to be a bit of a story about how I became a collector, and also focused on 3 painters that I really want to share with you over the years, collecting them, because I've been collecting for about 40 years. In 1970, I graduated from the University of Washington in cultural anthropology. And I went back for another year, a fifth year, in studying intensive Japanese and violin. And this was in preparation for law school, which I was, I mean, what are you going to do with a degree in cultural anthropology? I mean, I didn't want to be a professor. And so my dad cooked this up because he was with the Boeing company. And I don't know if any of you remember, but in the early 70s, it looked like Japan was going to inherit the earth. And so he thought it would be a good idea if I specialized in international law, somehow focused on interrelationship legally between Japan and America. And I thought it sounded like a pretty good idea, except I was really tuckered out. And he said, why don't you go to Japan after having studied it intensively, just to see if it worked, and just catch your breath between what you've been doing and the future studying law. So he put me on a delivery flight in 1971, and by a twist of fate, I ended up in a ryokan in northern Kyushu that changed my life forever. The upshot is I passed through Hawaii following that in 1972 with the idea actually of creating a gallery in Japanese graphics, lithographs, and woodblocks. I'd sold a violin in Tokyo. And so I decided to call it East of the Moon. And I rented this space on Kapiolani, and we opened the gallery, and about 7 people showed up. And by 11 days, I'd had it, and I just tore everything off the wall. There was a wonderful Japanese Hawaiian lawyer who bought most of my pieces, and I went back to Seattle to give my dad the bad news. So I remember the day, and he had just returned from Japan selling aircraft to the Japanese. And at a quiet moment following dinner, I broke the news to him. I said, I don't think I can become a lawyer. I'd really rather become a landscape artist. I just thought for sure he'd have a heart attack. But instead he put his arm around me and he said, Terry, your mother and I, the only thing we wanted for our children was for them to find their passion. And he said, it looks to me like you did. And so he released me, but the thought of going to school for another 4 years was so intimidating, I was broke into terminal leprosy thinking about that, that I knew there was another route, and that was to become a design build firm in which I would self-educate myself. I remember at the time, I had a friend who was in the landscape architecture department at the University of Washington, and he said, Terry, if you're going to go this route, there's a book you must read. And I said, what is it? And he said, it's a book by the eminent British landscape artist, Russell Page, who wrote a book called The Education of a Gardener. And so I went out and I got it, and it changed my life forever. I just simply could not believe the choreography of his life, because he went up the ladder the same way. He did not have a landscape architecture degree, and went about educating himself and worked for a number of astonishing people and also did corporate work. So I'd like to call my book The Education of a Collector. And so I'd like to tell the story of the events that occurred in my life that turned me into a fanatic, because collecting is really yet another form of addiction. And it's really hard to ever get over it. And it was great sharing at the end of my life a good portion of my collection with Honolulu, because it's meant everything for me to have this relationship with them. Also, I think in the audience, if I'm not mistaken, there must be Michio Morioka and her husband, Bob Meyer. There you are. I didn't want to proceed without saying something about Michio, because in the field, and it's rarefied air. She's actually referred to as Bodhisattva Michio Morioka Sensei. There's really nobody like her in the field, and we've been very active for many, many years, in which she worked very hard with Paul Berry on the Literati Modern Catalog, and then has followed me after that, putting various collections together and did all of the scholarship. And frankly, Michio, without you, none of this would be here today. And she's with her most amazing husband, Bob Meyer. And we spend a lot of time together, mainly in Tokyo, because their daughter, who I claim is my goddaughter, lives there with her wonderful family. And one of the hardships for all of us in COVID is we couldn't get there. And so now we find ourselves there rather than in Washington, because I live in southern Mexico now. But anyway, I'm so glad to see you here. And I quote voluminously from your writing, so correct me if I've missed something. I grew up in a family in rural Bellevue. My grandparents, let's see, where's my little thing here? My grandparents were born in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and there is my grandmother, Lula Washburn. She was born in 1888, the same year as my grandfather, and they left Baraboo in 1925. They left Baraboo in 1925 and moved to Bellevue, Washington. She's part of this story. She's actually the beginning of this story, because among her many skills, she was a hoedown fiddler. And her band was called Kit's Cornhuskers. And we lived in the country, and we really referred to ourselves as the Beverly Hillbillies. But she was she raised 8 children. She started out as a school mom, but she was really known for her musical abilities. And at the dinners every Sunday afternoon with 16 grandchildren and an equal number of aunts and uncles, after watching the Lawrence Welch show and trying to escape all the smoke in the room, because everybody smoked, so we lay on our backs, hopeful that the Lawrence Welch show would be over. And then we would find ourselves in this beautiful parlor, and she'd come in, and she'd still have her apron on, and she'd remove her apron, and she'd smoke a cigarette. And she always smoked it like this, looking at all of her grandchildren and saying, no. And after that was finished, she'd tuck her violin under her chin and play for the next 4 hours. My brothers got very tired of this because they would chord her on the piano. Everybody in the family was musical. Later in life, they would actually leave the house when she would show up because they knew she couldn't stop. But what was lovely for me as an 8-year-old, after listening to this and being absolutely seduced by her playing, I asked my parents when I was 8 years old if I could study the violin. And so they found a violin teacher in the nearby town, which is Bellevue, and it was Alice Sherman. And there's Alice with her brothers and sisters. She was born in Maine. They were all educated at the Boston Conservatory. There she's the pipsqueak. She's the one on the from the far right. And she lived in a beautiful house. And this was the turning point in my life. My parents would drive me there on Saturday mornings and pay her $5 for my lesson. But the way you got to her front door is you had to walk through her garden. And there was a picket fence around the property and a beautiful arbor trellis with fragrant roses and things climbing on it. And you pass through the gate and you see a curvilinear walk all the way to the front door, which was quite a ways away. And on either side of the walkway were these gorgeous flowering trees and flowering rhododendrons and azaleas and beautiful fragrant plants and old-timers like Colquitzia and Forsythia. And I was intoxicated generally by the time I got to the door, and I knock on the door, and Mrs. Sherman, who was 70 at the time, let's see. That's what she looked like, more or less, when I met her. I was 8 and she was 70. She lived to be 103. She'd greet me at the door, and I walk into this other world of Persian carpets and grand piano, and on the piano were autographed photographs of the leading violinists of the day, like Nathan Milstein and Erica Marini and Jascha Heifetz. And hanging on our walls were these amazing landscape paintings I learned later from the Hudson School, landscape school, paintings. It didn't look anything like our house. We didn't have paintings hanging on the wall. We had wallpaper. And the lone honeysuckle bush that was trying to escape the only place we could plant it in what looked like a sea of cement had climbed 2 stories up the side of a garage to escape its world. And the only thing wonderful about it was its fragrance and the abundance of hummingbirds. But anyway, what I realized was my entry into aesthetics really were the result of these extraordinary women who really informed me and transformed me as a child. And without them, I wouldn't be here in front of you, because of the introduction to the beauty of the world provided by artists that I saw in Ella Sherman's house, and just my love of the violin and taking that into the stratosphere over my life, finally ending my studies when I was 23. It just seemed, it was another world for me, and it had to come from some outer source, and this was the source. When I was 11 years old, 3 years into scratching my violin and driving my parents insane, our elementary school, it was elementary school, had an excursion to the Seattle Art Museum across Lake Washington, because we were on the other side of Lake Washington. It's the first time I'd ever been to a museum. And I remember the bus parking, and we saw this beautiful building. We only learned later that it was Art Deco. That didn't mean anything to 11-year-old. But what meant something to us were the 2 stone camels that were right at the entry on the right and the left, and we took turns riding them until security told us to get lost. Well, we entered the museum and walked up some stairs into a very narrow room, which I've never understood at the Volunteer Park Museum. It never made sense to me, except it spilled out into other rooms that were larger, and one in particular was the screen room. And that's where I laid my eyes on this screen by anonymous Machiashi painter from the 17th century, in which his subject were crows. And they're not just crows, they're a murder of crows. And I grew up in the country, and I knew all about crows, and I thought it was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen, as they're flying around and creating trouble and being obnoxious. But it was the combination of the gold and the black, I think, and just the power of 24 feet of this amazing subject that I stood transfixed in front of it, and I thought, someday I have to go to a country that could produce an artist that would paint like this. And 12 years later, I found myself in Japan, and it changed my life forever. I think trading in my earlier interest in law for becoming a garden maker segued into an earlier moment in my life when I was 19 and studying in London and became familiar with English gardens. So combining the 2 influences as I learned to become a gardener, thanks to Russell Page and my own activities, I started to also show an interest in the museum. I was in my mid-20s, And at the museum was a charismatic curator named William J. Rathbun. And his interest was literati painting, which explains why my first interest was literati painting. And under his influence and another charismatic gentleman teaching at the University of Washington, Professor Paul Berry, the combination of inspiration from both of them, in addition to three major collectors who were collecting various things from various periods of Japanese history, we were the epicenter of Japanese art in the United States for a long time, until it disintegrated and we all went to other places. What was interesting for me in starting my collecting, because of their influence, is that I collect landscape paintings because I learn from them. One of my techniques has always been to enter the painting. No matter what the painting is, I walk into the painting. And so if they were landscape paintings with waterfalls and trees and various things, I started paying attention to the way the rocks were organized. And so then I started organizing them in my own garden designs, which had a very heavy Japanese influence. And this is how basically the painting collection ended up being focused particularly on literati painters, because I was interested in them for a variety of reasons. They were impeccable people. They lived their lives as examples to others. They were tremendously gifted. They were completely obsessed with nature. And so for me, it was just an absolutely natural fit. And so I think that ultimately that led to a collection that started the literati modern concept that ultimately interested the museum here in Honolulu with Stephen Little and Julie White in that particular department. And so one of the greatest moments of my life was to actually see that collection here in Honolulu. And things have gone in all kinds of directions since then. Today, I would really like to talk about three artists that have heavily influenced me, and I'm still keenly interested in all of them. And we have examples of every one of these three painters in the current exhibition. The first artist is Tanomura Chokunyū, and he lived between 1814 and 1907. He lived to be very old. That's him. And he first studied Kano painting with Okamoto Baisetsu in 1820. He was 6 years old. Years later, when he was 8 years old, he started studying with Tanomura Chokunyū, who was one of the great illustrious literati painters, who died in 1835, but not before recognizing Chokunyu's great virtuosity. Chokunyū ultimately adopted him into his own family, and they often traveled together. After Chokunyū's death in 1835, he worked for 4 years on commissions for Buddhist temples and then moved to Sakai on the coast, where he was reputed to have had several hundred students. Now, this is a young man with several hundreds of students. In 1868, he moved to Kyoto, and in 1878, he was approached by the Kyoto prefectural government to support the first painting school in Japan, called the Kyoto Prefectural Painting School, or the Kyoto Fu Gagaku. In 1882, he established a private school for teaching Nanga in his home. It merged with the New Japan Nanga Association in 1896. Now, I want to mention something that Paul Berry talked about in Literati Modern, and said that basically, quote, in the late Meiji period, Chokunyu and Tomioka Tessai were known as the two senior figures in literati painting. Although they associated in a variety of ways, they had quite different temperaments. Chokunyū's lasting influence was through his disciples, while Tessai's legacy was his artistic vision and the style of painting he developed near the end of his life. So here are some of the paintings that I'd like to share with you. This is the oldest painting that we have of him, and it was in the Literati Modern gift purchase. And what I found staggeringly interesting about this is that it's a painting in the style of a Chinese painter named Wang Meng, who lived between 1308 and 1385. He was considered one of the four masters of the Yuan period, notable for his fine brushwork and complicated, dense compositions. The number of excessive pine trees may signify immortality, but the atmosphere of the painting is one of spiritual retreat. I was basically stunned by the execution of this painting and his enormous talent already at a relatively young age. You can definitely see the influence of Chikuden. Chikuden was an extraordinary teacher, and what was clear, he did identify in Chokunyu a virtuoso. Here are two paintings that are later. One on the left is from 1880, and the one on the right is from 1881. That one's in color. And both capture Chokunyu's mature Nanga style, both with poems, of course, written in Chinese. The ink painting on the left yes, the one on, let me see, excuse me. Yes, the one on the left is from 1880. And he often painted, he was very prolific, and in raising money for these new institutions, he often painted. There was a story that he painted something like 1,000 paintings within 2 weeks. And this is around the time these institutions were forming. And so you can see his great talent and his gift, and it is heavily literati in feeling. This is a hand scroll that was painted later in 1896, and it was one of the crowning pieces of the Literati Modern exhibit. And you can see just how gifted he was in his detailing of the rock outcroppings and the trees and the whole, again, another Chinese poem in the middle, upper middle. The whole idea is to take you into almost a fantasy land of the magnificence of nature. Because at the center of literati painting really is the love of nature, the adoration of nature, and the belief that all questions can be answered there. It carries an endorsement from one of his students. And I remember Paul Berry showed this to me in Kyoto years ago, and he said, "You have to buy it." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because next week they're going to cut it up." And I said, "Cut it up?" Because there's a colophon that is full of calligraphy that could be a separate painting remounted. And then they could almost cut this in half. And this is what's happening. There's so little understanding of the concept of hand scrolls in the West that the dealers can't sell them. And so they do everything they can in order to make them saleable. So I bought it. And it's here. And the Chokunyu collection in Honolulu is extensive. And there were already purchases of paintings by Chokunyu before this. This really fascinated me from around 1900, just before he died. And to give you some idea of just how much he was willing to experiment, what really blew my mind was that rock. Because I spent most of my life working with rocks. And I remember being in a rock yard in Seattle, outside of Seattle, in which a renowned Japanese-American landscape artist was selecting his stones for a project. And I remember him standing there. There were two piles of stones. And he pointed to the pile on the left and he said, "Those stones are alive." And then he pointed to the pile on the right and he said, "And those stones are dead." And I looked at the two piles and I kept wondering what he saw that was different about them. And then all of a sudden I agreed with him. I thought the pile on the right was really a total loss. This stone is alive, and it's surrounded by 8 rakan who are apparently having fun. And above them is this extraordinary pine that's pretending to be a waterfall. And there's a marvelous Chinese poem that he has added to this beautiful work of art. But I think that when we look back on the earlier works, the first one from the Chinese painter, and then the more conservative paintings of landscapes, this really indicates to me that he was on another level of consciousness. And I've always enjoyed, actually in real life, the stone is vibrating a lot more than it is here because of the projection. Now here are two side by side that are relatively late in his career. The one on the left has almost a Zen-like feeling because there's hardly anything in it. It's a celebratory painting of the New Year, in which he's got Fuji represented, and another beautiful poem dealing with the New Year. And even though Sean and I disagree about this, I'm absolutely convinced those are lips. I don't know why Sean can't see that they're lips. It's not the moon. It can't be the moon. And so anyway, I think he kissed the painting. I'm not sure. But anyway, contrasted to another style, this was really later in his life, you could see that I think he was envious of Tessai because Tessai had really stolen all the thunder as one of the late literati painters. And I think you can see in the painting on the right that he is definitely exploring. There's just something more abstract about it. The color's different. That development in the lower quarter is abstract. Anyway, I think it's easy to see that he was, even at the end of his life, capable of extraordinary paintings and was indeed one of the great teachers of the period and one of the first to actually be involved in the establishment of the early institutions.
Terry will change the name of the painting to Mount Fuji.
No, it's the Sean's lips. Now we're on to Hirai Bisen, who was born in 1889 and died in 1969. And I've been particularly focused on his work since I started collecting. He was born in Kyoto and he attended the Kyoto National School of Arts, graduating finally in 1906 at the age of 18. I think what always startles me about these biographies is just how young these people were. I mean, they were clearly virtuosos. It just is astonishing to be gifted so early in life. And he certainly was, just as Chokunyu and ultimately Shirakura Nihō, who we'll finish with. In 1907, he submitted a painting at the first Bunten and he received an award, which gave him quite an attitude, I understand. And instantly he became a celebrity. And throughout the Taisho period, he achieved great success, winning awards in various government exhibitions. And rather than entering an established artist studio, which was normal, he independently moved forward and was given a jury position in 1924. And in 1925, he was ranked as the 6th highest paid painter in the Osaka and Kyoto area. Isn't it interesting that they put statistics like that together then? You know, Are you number 6? Are you number 11? Are you on the list? And all of those things. But he was really, he was recognized. And the problem was, it developed later, but I'm going to carry on from this. And, well, what happened is in the early Showa period, his work was not well received, and he started to lose enthusiasm from the critics. Here is a quote from Michio Morioka from Modern, Literati Modern, that, quote, as a 26-year-old in 1915, he went to Tokyo for an exhibition as the recipient of the second place award and proclaimed to a news organization that he enjoyed playing tennis more than painting and had stayed 3 weeks with his brother practicing tennis. I mean, it all caught up to him, and his fame and fortune began to wane in the 30s and 40s, never to return to this stylistic breadth and originality that he achieved during the Taisho period and early Showa. I guess you could say he fizzled out. But is that any reason to discount the fact that he was a genius and had a brilliant, imaginative period in his life where no one could touch him, nor his imagination? For me, that's no reason to denigrate an artist. I mean, after all, in the end, Picasso was designing pajamas. So this is what caught my attention initially when I found this diptych. It's, of course, summer and spring and summer. Spring on the right, summer on the left. Not only is it attractive, I mean, for a variety of reasons from the point of view of the composition, but even though the painting on the right is more traditional, we know those are flowering trees and there's somebody working in the field. The painting on the left, however, was utterly fascinating to me because when I first looked at it, I thought it was a hedge, but it's not. It's bamboo. And I think even early on, he was experimenting with really ambiguous, radical ideas of presenting plant life and human life. But in this case, that's really what influenced me the most in pursuing paintings by him. Was his treatment early on. This is an early painting from the 1910s, so this is Taisho. After that, I just couldn't get enough of Bisen. This is a triptych of the rising sun, flanked by snow-laden flowering plum trees from the 1910s. This is an excellent example of Bisen using the popular Hinode image of the rising sun, which is iconic in Japanese paintings. He's flanked the almost sultry sun, bathed in warmth, by 2 studies of snowy plum trees. So there we have this extraordinary contrast between cold and hot, the duality. Another iconic image is the plum, celebrating its virtues of quiet beauty and strength, symbolizing grace. And as one of the 3 friends of winter, Sho Chikubai, this is something that is valued in Japanese art in many manifestations, not only paintings, but textiles and ceramics. The three friends of winter, pine, bamboo, and flowering plum. This is really a reference to it being one of the 3 friends of winter and celebrated by this rising sun. It's the first tree to bloom in late winter. And again, in Literati Modern, Morioka Sensei concludes her essay of this triptych with these beautiful words. A tantalizing contrast between cool and warm, complexity and austerity, the earth and sky. This set of paintings shows Bisen at the height of his creative power and originality. Here are two side-by-side, relatively early paintings again. And I think that it illustrates Bisen's imaginative way of painting landscapes with human presence. The painting on the right is called Autumn. It illustrates Bisen's eclecticism in borrowing pointillism from post-impressionists, combined with similar literati brush techniques like Busson's. Sean has done a tremendous amount of research in this area and has written extensively about several paintings. And he writes that this is a common theme. The fisherman on the left, it's a reference to a story of Zhang Zita, or Shita, how do you pronounce it? Thank you. Who lived at the conclusion of the Shang dynasty in the 11th century BC. He had served the corrupt last ruler of the Shang, and disappointed and disillusioned, he retired to spend his days fishing. Finally, a member of the Shao kingdom discovered him fishing and discerned that Zhang was a gifted military strategist, and with his help overthrew the Shang and established a new regime. Here in Bisen's creative mind, we have a wholly new interpretation of a traditional subject. These are actually masterpieces of Bisen, again from around the same period. Both dramatic. On the left, a boat about to negotiate a gorge in vibrant greens, thickly applied. The metaphor here is that of the hero's journey, which is something that Joseph Campbell talked about, the great American mythologist and cultural anthropologist. This is really Bisen's imagery of all of us heading out into the unknown, seeking greater understanding of perhaps the meaning of life, or just in search of one's passion or whatever. And the painting on the right is also, that is the subject matter of the blue Fuji, which is expertly painted in these almost 3 diagonals of energy. You can see the pilgrims down in the lower third. They're about to attempt to climb Fuji, but they can't climb Fuji without going through this mist, which, I mean, it can be anything you want. It can be your unconscious. It can be your bravery for having the courage to be vulnerable. It's got so much going on in it, as well as being an exquisite composition. And the first time I ever saw Fuji painted blue. These are iconic works by him, and as we continue to look at other things that he painted, this is what we're all referring to about his genius. He was just filled with it. He could do anything. He presented subjects in fascinating new ways, using color, also reinterpreting historical moments in both Chinese and Japanese history. Here's his impression of what happens when you get caught in a thing, when you get caught in a storm of thunder and lightning. And I mean, he really captures it, doesn't he? With that figure down in the lower corner trying to escape. It was the first time I ever saw Japanese paintings in which thunder and lightning were captured. You see them in a lot of dragon paintings from earlier periods, but here's a very contemporary treatment of an event in nature that we've all experienced in our lives. These two are also iconic paintings, especially the one on the right. Let's see what happened here. On the left, a scene in China from his trip there in 1913. This is another thing that the show emphasizes, the exhibition emphasizes, that because Japan was opened up by Perry in 1853 and then with the Meiji Restoration, in 1868, where all barriers sort of fell around convention. Many of these artists, these artists of the early 20th century, traveled, and they were keenly interested in China, and so Bisen has taken a trip to China here. And I think that what I like about it is the unconventional use of pink is disarming as the boat sails by humanity engaged in several activities. And on the right is a tour de force of creativity. It was the painting that was used for the cover of Literati Modern. While Lotus dates from 1915, it is another one of his supreme accomplishments of unparalleled imagination and skill. There is so much happening in this painting beyond the elegant grayish tone of the leaves contrasted by the blue of the water and the whiteness of the lotus flower. He applied a technique known as tsuji megaki, or creased line drawing, when in conjunction with gasenshi, a type of Chinese paper, creates these expressionistic tonalities, providing more texture and forming an ethereal aura around the much revered plant. Again, quoting from Literati Modern and Michio Morioka. The lotus rises from the mud to bloom above the water, and inherent in this subject is the well-known Buddhist notion of the lotus as a signifier of spiritual perfection and enlightenment. I was always fascinated by the painting on the left. It sort of reminded me of where I'd like to be most of the time, floating in a boat. I mean, it's really hard to imagine what it's floating in. I mean, it doesn't look like water. There, floating above these amazing trees and contemplating the moon. I'm a moon child. I was born in July. I've always been fascinated by the moon. I was drawn to this for several reasons, not only the improbability of this, but just the sheer beauty of the idea of being focused on one of the great phenomena of the natural world, our moon. To the right is another classic example of the way he painted trees, and also little images of villages, always in very strange angles or compositions, and again, gradating green, which was one of his favorite colors throughout his career. This has received a lot of attention. I originally bought it because I thought it was a reference to Japan entering World War II. It was there, all of their hopes and prayers for a successful outcome. Sean feels it was earlier, perhaps 10 or 15 years earlier. It really doesn't matter when it was painted because it's filled with iconography. Again, what an imaginative way to paint the idea of a ship heading out into the unknown, which happens to take the form of an origami. And growing out of the origami is this extraordinary pine tree. And there, to the right, is a torii gate, which is associated with Shintoism. And it's so formal elements, just chock full of imagery dealing with high hopes. I included this not so much to talk about it, but just to show how he evolved into a painter in the 1930s, in which he largely abandoned the crispness of the earlier paintings and went into this more amorphous style of abstraction. He was very gifted as an abstract painter. And I've had many diptychs in my collection. This is in my current collection in Mexico. And I never get tired of looking at it. Again, my technique is to enter the painting and feel the wind and smell the pine needles, hear the birds singing. This is one of my favorite screens by Bisen. I always thought it belonged in a dentist office. Wouldn't it be great in a dental office? I mean, it's just, I know people who have teeth that look like that. Actually, mine did before I had them fixed. But here again, he's been to China and he's just absolutely smitten with the beautiful mountains there. We're not quite sure where he was here. I love the monochromatic aspect of it. Again, it's relatively early, 1920s. It was with the Literati Modern collection. You can see he was capable of almost anything. I mean, it didn't matter if it was color or if it was monochromatic or if it was mountains or people or anything else. He just approached everything with tremendous energy and interpretation. This is Mount Hirai. And I gave this to the museum in honor of my husband, Steve Shanneman, who was very fascinated with concepts about higher consciousness and perhaps the meaning of life, if there is one. Of course, Hirai represents this place in the Taoist world in which the enlightened ones get to go there up to the top because it's so impossible to get there. They have to fly on the backs of cranes who are thought to live to be thousands of years old. So I really thought this represented Steve, and he had Pick's dementia, and he died in 2019. But toward the end, which was unusual about Pick's dementia, he still had an emotional core. And he'd wake up in the morning and he'd say, "I'm going to really miss you." And I would say, "No, I'm going to really miss you because you're about to embark on an adventure. You're going to cross the Rainbow Bridge. You're going to get on that freight train. It's at the speed of light heading for infinity." And he'd look at me and he'd say, "I know." So now I look at this and I think it's infinity. I think he's on one of those cranes. And it just turned out to be the most beautiful tribute to him while he was alive and even as he's passed. It really does represent, look at what Hirai, look at what Bisen's doing with this. What is he doing with this? I mean, not only does it look like it's airbrushed, which was 30 years before airbrushing even occurred, it's just the way he's painted the pinnacle and the color he chose, and just the extraordinary idea of, I suppose, higher consciousness. I mean, you can't get much higher than that. The final artist that I've been interested in is Shirakura. 5 more minutes? Oh, well, then let's just forget Shirakura. What do you think? I thought this was going really slowly. Okay, this will be easy because there aren't too many more pictures. Shirakura Nihō lived between 1896 and 1974. He was born in Niigata. In his teens, he moved to Tokyo to study watercolor and drawing from Ishii Hakute. He must have been something of a prodigy like the others because he submitted paintings to the Bunten in 1914 and 1915 when he was 18 and 19. They were accepted in 1917. They were accepted. And then in 1917, he moved to Kyoto and studied with Tajika Chikuson, the gifted disciple of Chokunyu. Later, he became a pupil of Komura Suiyun. Suiyun called him the Sanraku of Nanga, and what Suiyun is referring to is Sanraku Kano Sanraku, who was the great Kano painter, for his exciting and inventive approach, just like Sanraku. Around 1940, he changed his name to Kanyu, and his work became less dramatic and more refined in a more labored way. So these are early landscape paintings of his. Viewing Plum Blossoms, dated 1922. This was the first painting I bought of Shirakura. I was struck not only by the movement of the waterfall, but the way he imbued an almost pulsating rhythm of the coming from both animate and inanimate subjects. The small figure dressed in red taking it all in. Nothing seems stable in the painting except the huts in the upper third of the painting. The rocks appear anchored by the flowering plum trees. Here are all the components of an ideal life of a literatus living surrounded by nature, secluded and removed from the distractions of the rest of the world. Hermitage in Bamboo Grove dated 1920s. Unlike the first painting on the left, this painting appears to be more stabilized, with an effervescent middle ground enveloped in bamboo, which appears almost like a fog or mist. Again, the quintessential literatus hut perched on a rock outcropping. It seems that in Shirakura's body of work, he often jumped from one style to another throughout his life, often giving way to some very dramatic, very dramatic inventions of literati ideals. This struck me for its modernity. It's relatively early, and I thought, well, good Lord, it looks like an abstract painting. It's actually his impression of rocks and a waterfall. But this indicates his ability to really shift. Again, look at how different this is from the other paintings. This is a tour de force. This is a pair of two-panel screens of a recluse in the mountains. We have Shirakura at his most dramatic expression of the infinitesimal power of nature. Reminiscent of the drama of the first example shown, we cannot ignore the immense energy of the mountains and the waterfall. The ancient pine arching over the hermitage. There, two people appear to be chatting. The duality of the painting cannot be ignored. The literati seem to be in repose, shielded and protected from the elements. As nature frantically swirls around them, it harkens to the metaphor that although our lives can be at times frenetic and impossible, we must remember to find that place inside of all of us where serenity and tranquility abide, shielding us against these difficult forces. I'm going to move forward since time is of the essence, and let these go, except to say here are later paintings by him which really explore his willingness to go in directions that had really never ever been considered, especially the painting on the left, which is fascinating to me. Painting on the right really speaks to his training as a Western painter earlier in his life. But what I hope to show in all of this was the range of his abilities. And I'll end with this. Where are we here? Okay, pair of screens, ink and color on paper, mid-1930s to 40s. This is a Chinese fable, and he's painted it relatively late. It's almost time for World War II. And it is the story of Liu Chen and Ran Xiao on Mount Tiantai, in this much repeated fable of two gentlemen who got bored in their village and they wanted to, have an experience. So they started hiking up the mountain, and before long they found themselves in this paradise. There were two nubile females there on the left. You can see them. They almost look blissed out. Actually, we were talking earlier that they look like they're stoned. But they're the gentlemen over there on the right, and they're happy as hell. I mean, they are so happy to be living in paradise. And there's the pine tree, and there's the peach tree that only fruits. It takes several thousand years before it fruits. Well, it happens to be fruiting, and then there's this fungus, this thing called reishi, which has magical properties, but I don't think they're magical mushrooms. They have some others, but the whole thing just smacks of paradise and being somewhere where really it beats where they came from. But what happened is they got bored. This story is told over and over again, and I think it's so fascinating because there's some very strong metaphors here. They got bored because even in paradise, you can get bored. And so they were bored, and they went back to town. But when they got there, it was 300 years later, and their children had died, and they were now meeting the 7th generation of their children's children. Well, that didn't feel very good either. And so they said, well, we're just going to go back. We're going to go back to paradise. Well, they started up the mountain again, and they were never seen again. So for me, besides the realization that there's no such thing as paradise, I mean, paradise is what we experience every moment of our lives. The other thing that is so powerful for me is the fact that we can never go back. Anyway, thank you very much for putting up with me, and
6:01, perfect, Terry, brilliant. So I think we'll reserve questions for the reception, but we'd like to invite you all to the opening reception for the museum now, which will just be right outside the theater in the courtyard. And let's continue the party there. I look forward to talking with you more.